The acid rain had finally stopped, leaving the metal scrap heap glistening under the pale light of Raven's Reach's 3 moons. Kieran Vale wiped the caustic droplets from his protective goggles and continued his methodical search through the mountain of war debris. The junkyard stretched for miles in every direction, a testament to the prolonged conflict that had ravaged this once thriving mining colony. Kieran had been scavenging since dawn, his reinforced bag already heavy with salvageable parts, power couplings, neural interface modules, and the occasional intact weapon component. In this wasteland, these items were currency, and Kieran was better than most at finding the valuable among the ruined. Just need one more good find, he muttered to himself, his voice muffled by the filtration mask that protected his lungs from the toxic dust. At 32, Kieran had spent nearly half his life on Raven's Reach, arriving just as the corporate wars were winding down. He hadn't participated in the fighting, he was a craftsman, not a soldier, but he'd learned to profit from its aftermath. The planet itself was a harsh mistress. Outside the scattered settlements, the landscape was dominated by metal deserts where even the sand was composed of microscopic metal filings, ash plains from orbital bombardments, and the occasional acid marsh, remnants of chemical warfare that had permanently altered the ecosystem. The corporations had extracted what they wanted and left the rest to rot, including the people who'd had nowhere else to go. Kieran's eyes caught a reflection different from the usual dull gleam of scrap metal. Something polished, something maintained. He moved toward it, careful not to disturb the precariously balanced pile of debris. His hand grasped a piece of smooth, curved metal, and he pulled, revealing what appeared to be a shoulder plate of exceptional quality. "No way," he whispered, excitement building as he cleared away more junk. Piece by piece, a complete set of mercenary armor emerged, not the mass-produced kind issued to corporate foot soldiers, but the high-end, custom variety worn by elite operatives. The armor was primarily matte black with silver accents, unmarked by any corporate logo, which was unusual. Most mercenaries proudly displayed their affiliations. The armor was a marvel of engineering, adaptive exoskeletal joints, built-in medical systems, neural interface ports, and what appeared to be advanced stealth technology. Even damaged, it would fetch enough credits to keep Kieran comfortable for months, possibly longer if he found the right buyer. He ran his fingers along the helmet, noting the neural linkage ports that would connect directly to the wearer's brainstem, allowing for instantaneous reaction times and heads-up combat data. The armor had taken damage, a significant puncture in the chest plate and scorching along the left side, but the core systems appeared intact. "Who left you behind, I wonder?" Kieran murmured, examining the sophisticated technology. Equipment of this caliber was rarely abandoned. It was either salvaged by the victors or buried with its owner. As he lifted the chest piece to inspect it more closely, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The silence of the scrapyard had shifted subtly. He was no longer alone. "Put it back!" The voice behind him was female, low and raspy, as if damaged by smoke or chemicals. "Or you're next." Kieran froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't turn around immediately, instead watching the reflection in the polished surface of the armor. A silhouette stood about 10 paces behind him, humanoid, but the details were indistinct in the dim light. "This is public salvage territory," Kieran said, keeping his voice steady despite his racing pulse. "First to find, first to claim, that's the law here." "There is no law here," the voice replied. "Just those who survive and those who don't." Kieran slowly turned, raising his hand slightly to show he carried no weapon. The figure before him was tall and lean, dressed in tattered survival gear that had once been military grade. The stranger's face was partially obscured by a rebreather mask, but Kieran could see intense eyes studying him from beneath a shock of short, silver hair. The stranger's right arm hung awkwardly at their side, clearly injured, while the left held a pulse pistol aimed steadily at Kieran's chest. "Look," Kieran said carefully, "I don't want trouble. If this is yours, I'll walk away." The stranger took a step forward, and Kieran noticed a slight limp. Whoever this was, they were injured and trying not to show it. "It's not that simple," the stranger said. That armor contains information that certain people would kill to suppress. People who are probably tracking it right now. As if on cue, a distant rumble cut through the silence, the unmistakable sound of approaching transport engines. The stranger's head snapped toward the noise, then back to Kieran. They're coming. You have two choices. Leave the armor and run, or help me get it somewhere safe and maybe live to see tomorrow. Who's they? Kieran asked, though he already suspected the answer. Only corporate security or bounty hunters would be interested in recovered military tech. Orion Corps Recovery Team, the stranger said, confirming his fears. And they don't leave witnesses. Kieran made a split-second decision. He'd survived this long by knowing when to cut his losses, but also by recognizing opportunity. If this armor was important enough for a corporate recovery team, it was valuable beyond its mere components. I know a place, he said, quickly gathering the armor pieces and stuffing them into his reinforced bag. If we move now, we can lose them in the acid marshes. The stranger seemed to assess him for a moment, then nodded. I'm Valra. Valra Karas. Kieran Vale, he replied, securing his bag. Follow me and try to keep up. Together they descended the scrap mountain, Kieran leading them through a labyrinth of twisted metal and broken machinery. The sound of engines grew louder, and searchlights began to sweep across the junkyard's expanse. Stay low, Kieran whispered as they crouched behind a derelict assault vehicle, its hull riddled with blast holes. The marshes are 1/2 kilometer east, but we need to time this right. The corporate transports, 3 of them, heavily armored, settled on the far side of the scrapyard. Armored figures with scanning equipment began to disembark, their movements precise and methodical. They're tracking the armor's signature, Valra said, her breathing labored. Neural tech has a distinct energy pattern. Then we need to mask it, Kieran replied, thinking quickly. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small device, a signal dampener he used to avoid detection when salvaging in restricted areas. This won't block it completely, but it might confuse them long enough. He attached the dampener to the armor's control module and activated it. The device hummed softly as it generated an interference field. Now, Kieran said, gesturing toward a narrow path through the debris. They'll be focused on the main signal. We move with the search patterns, staying in their blind spots. They crept forward, using the rhythmic sweep of the searchlights to time their movements. Kieran's familiarity with the terrain proved invaluable as he led them through hidden passages in the scrap, avoiding detection points and unstable areas. The acid marshes loomed ahead, a grim expanse of bubbling, toxic pools and crystallized chemical formations that glowed an eerie blue in the darkness. Few ventured here willingly. The air was poisonous, and the ground treacherous. But it was also a dead zone for most scanning equipment. We'll need to move fast here, Kieran warned as they reached the marsh's edge. Step exactly where I step, and don't touch the liquid. Even a drop will burn through your gear. Valra nodded, her face pale with pain or exhaustion. Possibly both. I've been through worse. They began their careful traverse, navigating from one solid foothold to another. Behind them, shouts erupted from the scrapyard. They'd been spotted. Run! Kieran urged, abandoning caution for speed. They splashed through shallow puddles of diluted acid, their boots smoking slightly but holding against the corrosive substance. Pulse fire erupted behind them, energy bolts sizzling as they struck the marsh's surface, sending up plumes of noxious vapor. Kieran pulled Valra behind a crystallized formation as return fire narrowly missed them. They're persistent, Kieran muttered, peering around the crystal. But they won't follow us too deep into the marsh, too risky, even with protection. They don't need to, Valra replied grimly. They'll call in aerial support and flush us out. As if summoned by her words, the distinctive whine of a scout drone cut through the air above them. The small, agile machine hovered, its sensors scanning the area. We need to lose that drone, Kieran said, reaching for a rock. On my mark, run for that ridge. I'll create a distraction. He hurled the rock into a large acid pool several meters away. The resulting splash and cloud of vapor momentarily confused the drone's sensors, and they sprinted toward a ridge of crystallized chemicals that offered better cover. The marsh grew denser as they progressed, the pools larger and more numerous. The toxic environment was taking its toll. Kieran's lungs burned despite his mask, and Valra's limp had worsened. But the pursuit had indeed fallen back, unwilling to risk the dangerous terrain. After nearly an hour of careful navigation, they reached the marsh's far side, where the poisonous swamp gave way to a barren plain dotted with abandoned mining equipment. "The old shaft complex is just ahead," Kieran said, pointing to a cluster of dilapidated structures in the distance. "We can rest there and figure out our next move." Valra nodded, clearly exhausted. "Good. I need to check the armor systems anyway." The mining complex had been abandoned years ago when the primary ore veins ran dry. The corporations had simply moved on, leaving behind equipment too costly to transport off-world. Now it served as an occasional shelter for scavengers and other fringe dwellers of Raven's Reach. Kieran led them to a small processing facility, its walls still mostly intact. Inside, the air was stale but free from the marsh's toxic fumes. He secured the entrance and activated a small portable light, casting the interior in a soft glow. "Let me see that wound," he said, noticing the darkening stain on Valra's right sleeve. "It's nothing," she replied, though she didn't resist when he carefully examined the injury, a deep pulse burn that had penetrated her makeshift armor. "This isn't nothing," Kieran said, rummaging in his pack for a medkit. "Infection will set in fast in this environment." As he cleaned and dressed the wound, Valra watched him with curious intensity. "You're not just a scavenger," she observed. "Those were military movement patterns back there." Kieran's hands paused briefly. "I picked things up. You learn to survive or you don't last long here." "Fair enough," she conceded, wincing as he applied a healing compound to the burn. "We all have our stories." When he finished, Valra turned her attention to the armor they'd brought. She removed the pieces from Kieran's bag and arranged them methodically on the floor. "So," Kieran said, sitting back against the wall, "what's so special about this armor that Orion Corps is willing to send a recovery team?" Valra's expression darkened. "It contains evidence, war crimes committed during the corporate conflicts, massacres of civilians, illegal weapons testing, forced neural experimentation. And you know this how?" She met his gaze steadily. "Because I was there. This is my armor." Kieran stared at her, reassessing everything. "You're a mercenary." "Was," she corrected. "Until I saw too much. The neural interface in this armor records everything: tactical data, biometrics, visual and audio feeds. It's all stored in a secure black box that activates if the system detects the wearer is in mortal danger." "And you were in mortal danger," Kieran surmised. "My own squad tried to kill me when I questioned orders to execute civilians," she said, her voice flat. "I barely escaped with my life, had to abandon the armor when I took a hit that breached the power core. I've been trying to recover it ever since. So why not just extract the data and transmit it? The black box has biological security. It only unlocks for my neural signature while I'm wearing the armor. And I can't just transmit it from anywhere. Orion has communication blockers across most of the planet. I need to reach a rebellion outpost with a secure quantum channel." Kieran ran a hand through his dust-caked hair. "So we're carrying evidence that could bring down one of the most powerful corporations in the system, with their security forces hunting us, and we need to find rebels who may or may not still exist." Valra's lips quirked in a grim smile. "That about sums it up." "Perfect," Kieran muttered. "Just perfect." Despite his complaints, Kieran helped Valra begin repairs on the armor. His skills as a craftsman proved useful as they replaced damaged connections and bypassed fried systems. By dawn, they had restored basic functionality to the exoskeleton and power core. "It won't be combat ready," Valra explained as she carefully tested a neural interface connection. "But it should work long enough to extract the data." Kieran nodded, too exhausted to speak. He hadn't slept, keeping watch while also assisting with the repairs. Get some rest, Valra said, noting his fatigue. I'll take first watch. How do I know you won't leave with the armor once I'm asleep? Kieran asked, only half joking. You don't, she replied simply. But I owe you for the help, and I don't leave debts unpaid. It wasn't entirely reassuring, but Kieran was too tired to argue. He leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes, sleep claiming him almost instantly. He awoke to Valra shaking his shoulder urgently. Company, she whispered, gesturing toward the entrance. Outside, a sleek black vehicle had pulled up to the mining complex. It wasn't corporate security. The design was too customized, too predatory. Bounty hunters, Valra confirmed, reading his expression. Orion must have put a contract out. Through the narrow window, Kieran could make out 3 figures disembarking from the vehicle. They moved with the confident precision of professionals, scanning the area with handheld devices. The dampener won't fool them for long, he said. We need another exit. Valra pointed to a maintenance hatch in the floor. The complexes were all connected by underground passages. Mining crews used them during acid storms. Kieran nodded and helped her gather their equipment. The armor, partially repaired, went back into his reinforced bag. They slipped through the hatch just as the bounty hunters breached the main entrance. The tunnel below was narrow and damp, clearly not maintained since the mining operation shut down. They moved as quietly as possible, using Kieran's light at its lowest setting to navigate. Who exactly are we looking for? Kieran whispered as they moved deeper into the tunnel network. A resistance group led by Mara Chin, Valra replied. Former corporate security who defected when she discovered what her employers were doing to the local population. Last I heard, they were operating from the old central processing facility in Sector 7. Sector 7 is on the other side of the ash plains, Kieran pointed out. That's at least 2 days on foot, assuming we don't run into more trouble. Got a better idea? He didn't. The tunnels eventually led them to another abandoned facility, this one larger and partially collapsed. They emerged cautiously, scanning for threats before moving into the open. The ash plains stretched before them, a gray wasteland where nothing grew. The fine powder that covered the ground was the remnant of forests and cities reduced to dust by orbital strikes during the war's peak. Walking across the plains meant leaving tracks, but going around would add days to their journey. We'll wait until dark, Kieran decided. The ash reflects less light then, and it'll be harder to spot us from the air. They found a defensible position among the ruins and settled in to wait. Valra used the time to continue working on the armor, focusing on the neural interface components. Why did you help me? She asked suddenly, not looking up from her work. Back at the scrapyard, you could have just handed over the armor and walked away. Kieran considered the question. Curiosity, maybe. Or maybe I'm just tired of the corporations thinking they own everything and everyone on this rock. Noble sentiments for a scavenger. I wasn't always a scavenger, he replied. Before the war, I was an engineer, designed habitat systems for off-world colonies. What happened? Corporations happened. They decided habitat design should prioritize profit over safety. I disagreed publicly. Next thing I knew, I was blacklisted across 3 systems. He shrugged. Ended up here because nobody checks credentials on a war-torn planet. Valra nodded slowly. So it's personal. Isn't it always? As dusk fell, they prepared to cross the ash plains. The 3 moons provided just enough light to navigate by, while keeping them mostly in shadow. They moved at a steady pace, their footprints unavoidable but hopefully difficult to track in the dim light. The journey across the plains was eerie and silent. No wildlife, no vegetation. Just endless gray powder that swirled around their ankles with each step. Occasionally they passed the skeletal remains of buildings or vehicles, monuments to the destruction that had been visited upon Raven's Reach. They were midway across when Valra suddenly raised her hand, signaling Kieran to stop. She pointed to the horizon, where a faint light was moving in a search pattern. Drone, she whispered. Advanced model. It can detect heat signatures. They had nowhere to hide on the open plain. Kieran quickly assessed their options. The ash, he said, dropping to his knees. It insulates. If we bury ourselves, we might mask our heat signatures enough to fool it. They dug quickly, creating shallow depressions in the ash. Kieran helped Valra cover herself completely, then did the same, leaving only a small air hole near his mouth. Through a tiny gap, he watched the drone approach. The machine hovered nearby, its sensors sweeping the area. For a heart-stopping moment, it paused directly above them. Kieran held his breath, feeling sweat trickle down his spine despite the night's chill. Then, apparently, satisfied, the drone moved on, continuing its pattern away from them. They waited several minutes before carefully emerging from their ash graves, looking like ghosts in the moonlight. That was too close, Kieran muttered, brushing the fine powder from his clothes and equipment. They're being thorough, Valra agreed, which means they know exactly what they're looking for. They pushed on through the night, increasing their pace despite the risk of exhaustion. By dawn, they had reached the far side of the ash plains, where the gray wasteland gave way to rocky terrain dotted with the remains of industrial infrastructure. Sector 7's central processing facility loomed ahead, a massive complex of interconnected structures that had once refined raw ore into valuable minerals. Now it stood silent, apparently abandoned like so much else on Raven's Reach. Looks deserted, Kieran observed as they surveyed the facility from a rocky outcropping. It's supposed to, Valra replied. The resistance wouldn't survive if they advertised their location. They approached cautiously, watching for signs of surveillance or security measures. At the main entrance, Valra pointed out nearly invisible markers that would be meaningless to most observers. Recognition signs, she explained. They change regularly, but this general pattern means the facility is still active. She led them not to the main entrance but to a service door partly concealed by debris. There she tapped a specific rhythm on the metal surface. Minutes passed with no response. Maybe they've moved on, Kieran suggested. Maybe, Valra conceded, though she looked troubled. She was about to try again when the door slid open a fraction, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Identify, came a terse command from within. Valra Karis, former Orion Corps special operative, she replied. I have evidence of war crimes committed in the Eastern Territories. And your companion? Kieran Vale. He helped me recover the evidence. A pause, then, weapons on the ground, enter slowly. They complied, carefully placing their limited armaments down before stepping through the narrow opening. The door slid shut behind them, plunging them into darkness for a moment before dim lights activated, revealing a sparse antechamber and 3 armed figures. The apparent leader, a woman with dark skin and close-cropped hair, studied them intently. Mara's not here, she said, addressing Valra. Left 2 weeks ago for the southern outpost. We need her communication set up, Valra explained. I have neural-locked data that needs to go off-world. The woman's expression remained neutral. Proof? Valra gestured to Kieran's bag. May I? At the woman's nod, Kieran carefully removed the partially repaired armor. Valra took the helmet component and pointed out specific markings. Special Operations Unit 7, Orion Corps. My personal gear, the black box is intact. The resistance fighter examined the markings, then nodded. Follow me. But know that if this is a trap, you won't leave this facility alive. They were led deeper into the complex, through corridors that showed signs of recent habitation despite attempts to maintain the abandoned appearance. Eventually, they reached a central area where a dozen people worked at various stations, maintaining equipment or monitoring communications. Their guide introduced herself as Lena, Mara Chin's second-in-command. What exactly do you have? She asked once they were seated in a more private area. Valra explained about the armor's recording capabilities and the evidence it contained. Footage of civilian executions, experimental weapons used on populated areas, neural tampering on prisoners. Enough to bring international sanctions against Orion Corps and possibly criminal charges against their leadership. Lena looked skeptical. Corporations have buried worse. Not with this level of detail, Valra insisted. Not with biometric confirmation of who gave the orders. This isn't just witness testimony, it's irrefutable evidence from Orion's own systems. While they talked, Kieran studied the resistance operation. It was smaller than he'd expected, but well organized. These weren't just idealists. They had military training and discipline. Still, they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned compared to corporate forces. If we help you access this data, Lena said finally, we want a copy, and we choose where it gets sent off-world. Valra nodded. Agreed, but we need to move quickly. Orion has bounty hunters tracking us, and they're getting close. Lena led them to a communications center housed in a shielded room. The equipment there was a mix of corporate-grade technology and jury-rigged systems, but it looked functional. Our quantum channel operates for 30 seconds every 12 hours, Lena explained. The next window is in 3 hours. Will that be enough time to extract your data? Valra examined the neural interface components of her armor. It should be, if we can get the power system stabilized. They set to work, Kieran focusing on the power connections while Valra prepared the neural linkage. The resistance provided tools and spare parts, clearly interested in the outcome despite their cautious demeanor. As they worked, Kieran noticed increasing activity around the facility. More guards were being posted, and people moved with greater urgency. Something's happening, he murmured to Valra. She glanced up briefly. They're preparing for trouble. They know what happens to anyone who crosses Orion. 2 hours into their preparations, alarms suddenly blared throughout the complex. Lena rushed into the communications room, her expression grim. Perimeter sensors have been triggered, she announced. Multiple vehicles approaching from the north and east. Looks like a corporate strike team. At least 20 operatives. How did they find us so quickly? Kieran asked, though he suspected the answer. The armor, Valra confirmed. Even with the dampener, the neural tech has a unique signature. They must have expanded their scanning range. We need to move up the transmission. Lena decided. I'll have the team prepare for an emergency broadcast. The data extraction isn't complete. Valra objected. I need more time. Time is the one thing we don't have. Lena replied grimly. Finish what you can. We'll hold them off as long as possible. The resistance fighters moved with practiced efficiency, securing defensive positions and preparing for the assault. Kieran helped where he could, but his focus remained on helping Valra complete the data extraction. The armor's systems were finally stabilized enough for Valra to attempt the neural connection. She positioned the helmet carefully, wincing as the interface needles aligned with her neural ports. This will be unpleasant, she warned Kieran. The system wasn't designed to be used with damaged components. Will it kill you? He asked bluntly. Probably not, but it won't be gentle. Before he could respond, she activated the interface. Her body went rigid, eyes wide but unseeing as the neural connection established. Data began streaming across the attached monitor, combat footage, location timestamps, identification markers for personnel. Outside, the first sounds of combat erupted, the distinctive whine of pulse weapons and the duller thud of projectile launchers. The resistance was engaging the corporate forces, but from the increasing intensity, they were being pushed back. Lena returned, now wearing combat gear and carrying additional weapons. We've confirmed it's Orion Security, led by bounty hunter Jax Harrow. They're here for the armor and anyone associated with it. How long can you hold them? Kieran asked, accepting a pulse rifle she offered. Minutes, not hours, she replied honestly. Our emergency broadcast system is ready, but we need that data now. Valra remained locked in neural communion with the armor, unable to respond. Kieran looked at the progress indicator. The extraction was only at 60%. We need to buy more time, he said. Lena nodded grimly. I'll redirect our forces to focus on the main entrance, but once they breach, it's over. As she left to coordinate the defense, Kieran positioned himself at the communication room's entrance. The sounds of fighting drew closer, accompanied by shouts and the occasional explosion. The progress indicator crawled upward, 70%. 75, 80. A massive blast shook the facility, and the lights flickered momentarily. The main entrance had been breached. Now it was just a matter of time. Come on, Valra, Kieran muttered, glancing back at her still form. We're running out of road here. 90%, 95. The first corporate troops appeared at the end of the corridor, their black armor marked with Orion's distinctive logo. Kieran and the remaining resistance fighters opened fire, forcing them to take cover. Extraction complete, called one of the technicians monitoring Valra's progress. Valra's eyes cleared as the neural connection disengaged, though she seemed disoriented. Did we get it? She asked, her voice weak. All of it. The technician confirmed, transferring the data to the broadcast system. Transmission ready. Do it, Valra ordered, removing the helmet with shaking hands. The technician activated the quantum channel, and the facility's power dimmed as energy was diverted to the transmission. On the monitor, they could see the data being uploaded to an off-world receiver, some distant station where the evidence would be backed up and distributed to authorities and media outlets across multiple systems. In the corridor, the fighting intensified. Several resistance fighters fell, and the corporate troops advanced methodically. Among them strode a tall figure in distinctive modified armor, Jax Harrow, the bounty hunter. Unlike the corporate troops, Harrow's movements were fluid and unpredictable, making him a difficult target. Transmission at 50%, the technician reported. Channel stable, but we're losing power. They're targeting our generators, Lena called from her defensive position. We won't last much longer. Kieran made a decision. Get Valra out through the emergency tunnels. I'll hold them here until the transmission completes. That's suicide, Valra objected, struggling to her feet. Probably, he agreed. But someone has to make sure this gets out. Isn't that why you risked everything to recover the armor? Before she could argue further, another explosion rocked the facility. Closer this time. Part of the ceiling collapsed, blocking half the corridor, but also creating a more defensible position for Kieran. Take her, he told Lena. Make sure the data reaches the right people. Lena hesitated, then nodded sharply. The resistance won't forget this, she promised, helping Valra toward the rear exit. Neither will I, Valra said, her eyes meeting Kieran's one last time. Thank you. Then they were gone, leaving Kieran and two resistance fighters to guard the transmission. He took position behind the fallen debris, pulse rifle ready. Transmission at 70%. The technician called out, signal degrading but still connected. The corporate troops, seeing the reduced resistance, pressed their advantage. Pulse fire intensified, superheating the air and leaving scorch marks on the walls. One of the resistance fighters fell, a pulse bolt having found a gap in their makeshift barricade. Jax Harrow's voice carried down the corridor. Surrender the armor and the data, and you might live to see tomorrow. Come and take it, Kieran replied, firing a burst that forced the bounty hunter back into cover. Transmission at 85%, the technician reported, his voice tight with tension. Power reserves critical. The remaining resistance fighter beside Kieran took a hit to the shoulder, crying out in pain but maintaining his position. Kieran knew they couldn't hold much longer. 90%, the technician called. Almost there. Jax Harrow made his move, vaulting over a barrier with inhuman speed. Some sort of enhancement, Kieran realized. The bounty hunter landed in a roll and came up firing, his shots precisely targeted. Kieran felt a burning impact in his side, then another in his leg. He slumped against the barricade, still firing but with decreasing accuracy as pain clouded his vision. Transmission complete, the technician shouted triumphantly. Data sent. In that moment, Kieran felt a surge of satisfaction despite the agony of his wounds. The evidence was out, irretrievable, unstoppable. Whatever happened now, Orion Corps would face justice for their crimes. Jax Harrow seemed to realize it too. His next shots weren't aimed at Kieran, but at the transmission equipment, destroying it in a shower of sparks and melted components. Too late, Kieran managed to say through gritted teeth. It's already gone. The bounty hunter approached, his helmet's faceplate retracting to reveal a scarred visage. "Then so are you," he said coldly, raising his weapon. Before he could fire, the facility shook with the largest explosion yet. Emergency systems blared warnings of structural collapse. The Resistance's last act had been to trigger the facility's self-destruct sequence. Harrow hesitated, then turned and sprinted back toward the exit, shouting orders to his team to evacuate. Kieran dragged himself toward the technician, who lay wounded but alive near the destroyed equipment. "Can you move?" he asked. The man nodded weakly. "Emergency tunnel. Behind the server rack." Together they stumbled through the hidden exit as the facility began to come apart around them. The narrow tunnel seemed endless, their progress slowed by their injuries. But finally they emerged onto the rocky terrain several hundred meters from the main complex. Behind them, the central processing facility collapsed in on itself, burying the corporate strike team's vehicles and any soldiers too slow to escape. In the distance, a small transport, presumably carrying Valra and the surviving resistance members, disappeared over the horizon. "Now what?" the technician asked as they found shelter in a shallow cave. "Now we disappear," Kieran replied, applying emergency medical patches to their worst wounds. "Once that data hits the public channels, nowhere on this planet will be safe for anyone associated with it." They rested through the day, treating their injuries as best they could with limited supplies. By nightfall, they were able to move again, heading toward a small settlement where the technician had contacts. 3 days later, the news reached even the isolated community they'd taken refuge in. Evidence of Orion Core war crimes had been released simultaneously across multiple systems. Corporate stock was in freefall, executives were being detained, and international peacekeepers were being dispatched to Raven's Reach and other affected planets. Kieran watched the reports on a public view screen, a hood concealing his face. He was a wanted man now. Orion might be facing justice, but they still had resources and influence. They would want revenge against those who had exposed them. A week after the data transmission, his wounds sufficiently healed for travel. Kieran returned to the scrap heap where it had all begun. The place seemed smaller somehow, less significant in light of recent events. He climbed to the spot where he'd found the armor, now just an unremarkable depression in the junk pile. As he stood there, contemplating the strange path fate had set him on, a familiar voice spoke from behind him. "Looking for something else to cause trouble with?" He turned to find Valra standing a few meters away. She looked better, her wounds healed, her posture no longer favoring her injured side. She wore nondescript traveler's clothes rather than her tattered military gear. "How did you find me?" he asked. "Wasn't hard. You're a creature of habit. Kieran Vale." He smiled slightly. "I thought you'd be off-world by now." "Soon," she agreed. "The Resistance has arranged transport for key witnesses, including you, if you're interested." Kieran looked out over the vast scrapyard, then up at the perpetually hazy sky of Raven's Reach. This broken world had been his home for years, but there was nothing left for him here. "What's out there for someone like me?" he asked. "Justice," Valra replied. "The chance to testify, to make sure Orion and the other corporations answer for what they've done. And after that?" She shrugged. "A fresh start, maybe. Your choice." Kieran considered it. He was no hero, no crusader for justice. He'd simply made a choice when confronted with the truth, the same choice he hoped anyone would make. "When do we leave?" he asked finally. Valra smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her usually severe features. "Right now, transport's waiting." As they descended the scrap mountain together, Kieran took one last look at the wasteland that had shaped him. He had come to Raven's Reach seeking anonymity, a place to disappear after his life had fallen apart. Instead, he'd found purpose in the most unlikely place, a discarded piece of armor in a forgotten scrap heap. Sometimes, he reflected, the most valuable salvage was the kind you never expected to find.